Every night, my 19-year-old daughter slipped into my stepson's bedroom, and I heard a moaning sound. Then I found a box of condoms under his bed, and my entire family turned against me when I called them out. I want to say up front that I am not a paranoid man. I'm not the kind of father who reads his daughter's diary for fun or checks phone records out of boredom. I spent 22 years working as a claims adjuster, a job that trains you to look for the story behind the story, to notice the small inconsistency that tells you someone is lying about how the fender got dented. I trusted my instincts. And for 3 weeks, my instincts told me that something was happening in my house that no father should have to witness the evidence of, let alone confront. I need to back up, though, because none of this makes sense without knowing what happened to my family 2 years before any of this started. My first wife, Rachel, died of ovarian cancer when our daughter Emma was 17. It was slow, and then it was fast, the way these things go. And by the time it was over, Emma had spent the better part of a year watching her mother disappear one appointment at a time. She stopped talking about it almost immediately after the funeral. She went back to school 3 days later because she said sitting at home made it worse, and I let her because I didn't know what else to do. I was drowning myself. I didn't notice, or I noticed and told myself it wasn't my business to notice, that my daughter had stopped sleeping through the night. I found out much later that she'd been having what she called bad nights for months before I ever knew her stepbrother had anything to do with them. I met Karen about 1.5 years after Rachel passed, through a grief support meetup of all places, which I know sounds like the beginning of a very different kind of story than this one. Karen was widowed too. Her husband had died in a car accident when her son Jason was 16. She understood what it was to raise a kid through loss without a manual. We dated quietly for 8 months, and when I finally introduced her to Emma, and introduced Jason to both of us, it went about as well as these things go, which is to say, awkwardly, but not badly. Jason was 20 at the time, 2 years older than Emma, tall and quiet in a way that some people mistake for standoffish, and other people, correctly, read as careful. He'd learned to be careful. Losing a parent young does that to you. We got married 11 months later. Karen and Jason moved into our house, mine and Rachel's house, technically, though I'd started thinking of it as just the house by then, because it had more room and because Emma didn't want to leave the neighborhood where she'd grown up, where her mother's rose bushes were still blooming out back every June, whether anyone tended them or not. Jason took the bedroom at the end of the hall, across from Emma's. Karen and I took the primary suite downstairs. It felt for a while like it was going to work. 2 broken families sanding down their rough edges against each other until something smoother came out the other side. I want to be clear that I liked Jason. I want to be clear about that because of everything that happened later. Because I need you to understand that what I did not do out of some instinctive distrust of the boy. I liked him. He mowed the lawn without being asked. He fixed the garbage disposal the first week he lived with us because he'd watched a video on it. And when I tried to pay him for the part he'd bought, he waved me off and said, "You're letting me live here for free, man. It's the least I can do." He was polite to Emma, in the distant way that new step-siblings often are, a nod in the hallway, "You want the last slice?" over pizza. Nothing more. I had no reason to think there was anything between them. That's what made the discovery, when it came, feel like the floor had opened up under the entire house. It started with sound. Our house is a 100-year-old colonial with the kind of thin walls and creaky floors that make privacy a polite fiction. Karen and I slept downstairs, but sound traveled through the old heating vents in a way that meant if you were awake at the right hour, in the right spot in the house, You could hear more than you wanted to. I started noticing it in early October. A soft creak from upstairs, always around midnight, always the same door. Emma's door. Then a few seconds later, another door. Jason's. The first night I heard it, I assumed she'd gone to ask him something, or that she couldn't sleep and wanted company the way siblings do sometimes when a house is unfamiliar and quiet. I didn't think anything of it. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The second night, I heard it again, and this time I lay awake, listening, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that 19-year-olds and 21-year-olds who happen to share a step-parent do not need a chaperone. But something about the pattern of it bothered me. It wasn't a knock and enter. It was quiet, practiced. Like she'd done it enough times that she knew exactly which floorboard by his door groaned and which ones didn't, and she was avoiding them. By the third week, I had started keeping a mental log without admitting to myself that's what I was doing. Every night, between 11:40 and midnight, Emma's door opened. Every night, Jason's door opened a few seconds later. And every night, she did not come back out until sometime after 1 in the morning, sometimes later. I told myself there were 100 explanations. I told myself I was the kind of father who owed his daughter the benefit of the doubt. Then, on a Tuesday night in late October, I woke up to use the bathroom around 12:30, and as I passed the base of the stairs, I heard it. A sound from Jason's room, muffled through the door and the old plaster, but unmistakable in its rhythm, even if I couldn't make out words. A low, rising moan, cut short, followed by hushed voices, followed by another sound like someone catching their breath. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for what felt like a full minute, my hand on the banister, my heart doing something ugly and fast in my chest. Every part of me wanted it to be nothing. Every part of me also knew, with the sick clarity of a man who has spent 2 decades reading the small details other people miss, that I had just heard something I was not supposed to hear. I did not go up the stairs that night. I want you to understand that about me. I did not burst through a door and make a scene based on one sound in the dark. I went back to bed. I lay next to Karen, who slept through all of it, blissfully unaware, and I told myself I would find out for certain before I said a single word to anyone. The chance came 4 days later, on a Saturday, when Karen took Jason and Emma both to visit her sister 2 towns over for the afternoon. A rare outing where I'd begged off, claiming a work call I didn't actually have, because something in me wanted the house empty. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything, that I just wanted to understand the geography of what I'd heard, to prove to myself it had an innocent explanation. I went into Jason's room. It was neat, unremarkable. A 21-year-old's room with a desk, a laptop, textbooks from the community college business program he was enrolled in, a couple of framed photos of his father. I don't know what made me look under the bed. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the same trained eye that had spent 2 decades finding the thing people hoped wouldn't be found. But I got down on my knees on his carpet, feeling like a stranger in my own home, and I looked. And there it was, pushed toward the back near a stack of old shoeboxes. A box of condoms. Not new, opened. Several missing. I sat back on my heels and felt something in my chest cave in like wet drywall. I did not confront anyone that day. I told myself I needed to think. I told myself a lot of things over the following 72 hours, most of which amounted to a man trying to build a case in his head, so that when he finally said the words out loud, no one could accuse him of overreacting. I started paying closer attention to everything. The way Emma flushed pink when Jason passed her the salad at dinner and said, Here. The way she disappeared to study in her room right after he went upstairs. The fact that she'd started showering at 12:30 in the morning, which I'd noticed but never questioned before, telling myself teenagers keep odd hours. I found Emma's old journal by accident on the following Wednesday, not because I was snooping through her things. I want to be honest here, even though it doesn't reflect well on me, and say that by that point, 3 weeks into this, I absolutely was snooping. I had crossed whatever line I'd told myself I wouldn't cross, because I was a father trying to protect his daughter from what I believed was a predator sleeping 40 feet from her bedroom. I found it in her nightstand drawer while looking for I don't even remember what, and I read 3 pages before I made myself stop, and what I read undid whatever restraint I had left. He's the only one who gets it. I don't know how I'd get through the nights without him. I need him more than I've ever needed anyone. It's our secret, and I want to keep it that way, because if Dad knew, he'd never understand. I closed the journal. I sat on the edge of my daughter's bed with my head in my hands for a long time. That night, I didn't wait for midnight. At dinner, I set my fork down and I said, in a voice that I thought was calm, and that Karen later told me was not calm at all, I need to ask both of you something, and I need an honest answer. Emma went white. Jason went very still. The particular stillness of someone who has been dreading a moment and has just watched it arrive. I know you've been going into his room every night, I said to Emma, then to Jason, and I found what's under your bed. The table went silent, in the specific way that tells you everyone present understands the accusation even before it's spoken aloud, which somehow made it worse, because it meant I wasn't imagining the guilt on their faces. There was clearly something they were hiding, and in that moment, hiding looked exactly like confirmation. "Dad," Emma started, her voice cracking. "Don't," I said. I was gripping the edge of the table. "Don't you dare tell me it's not what it looks like. I've heard you. I've heard the sounds coming out of that room at midnight, Emma. I found the box under his bed. Half of it's gone." Karen's face had gone through about 4 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, alarm, and then something that looked horribly like she already knew something I didn't, which at the time I took as evidence she'd been covering for them. "You went through his room?" Karen said, and her voice had an edge to it I'd never heard directed at me before. "You went through Jason's room, David?" I had to know what was going on in my own house. "That is not an answer to what I asked you." Jason hadn't said a word yet. He was staring at the table, his jaw working, and I remember thinking, in the ugliest part of my mind, that his silence was the most damning thing in the room. Because an innocent man defends himself immediately and loudly, and a guilty one goes quiet and calculates. I know now how wrong that instinct was. I know now that there is a third kind of silence. The silence of someone protecting a secret that isn't his to tell, weighing the cost of defending himself against the cost of breaking a promise to someone more vulnerable than he is. But I didn't know that yet. That night, all I saw was a 21-year-old man sitting mute across from me while my 19-year-old daughter cried into her hands. "She's my daughter," I said, and my voice cracked on the word in a way that embarrassed me even as it happened. "She just lost her mother. She's vulnerable, and you," I looked at Jason, "you've been in there with her every night for weeks, with condoms under your bed. What am I supposed to think?" "You could ask," Jason finally said, quietly, "before you go through my room like I'm a criminal." "I'm asking now." "No," he said, and something in his voice hardened. You already decided. You went through my stuff and you decided, and now you're just telling us what you decided." He wasn't wrong, and some small, still rational part of me knew it, even as the rest of me was too far gone to care. Emma stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "You think I'd with him?" she said, and I remember being confused by the specific horror in her voice. A horror that didn't sound like guilt, that sounded instead like something closer to disgust at the accusation itself, though at the time I read it as the outrage of someone caught. "Dad, he's basically my brother. Is that honestly what you think of me? That I'd sneak into my stepbrother's room every night to... God, I can't even say it." "Then tell me what I heard," I said. "Tell me what's under his bed." "I can't," she said, and burst into tears, and ran up the stairs, and I heard her door slam, and a moment later I heard Jason's chair push back too, and he went after her, not toward me, not offering me a single further word of explanation. And that, his choosing to go comfort her, instead of staying to defend himself to me, felt at the time like the final confirmation of everything I'd feared. Karen did not go after either of them. She sat across from me at the table, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low and shaking with a fury I had never once seen from her in the 2 years I'd known her. "You humiliated my son," she said, "at the dinner table, based on a sound through a wall and a box you found by going through his private property." "Karen, I heard—" "I don't care what you think you heard," she said. "You didn't come to me. You didn't come to either of them and ask like a decent human being. You built a case against my son like he was a suspect, and you were building a file. And then you convicted him in front of the whole family before he ever got a chance to explain." "Then let him explain," I said. "I'm right here. I'm asking." "He can't," she said. And there it was again, that flicker of something she knew that I didn't, and it made me angrier rather than more curious. Because in my mind, at that moment, "she can't explain it either" meant there is nothing innocent to explain. Can't or won't? "Both," Karen said. "And I need you to trust me on this, David, the way a husband is supposed to trust his wife, and just let it go for now." "Let it go," I repeated. "My daughter is sneaking into your son's room every night. There's a box of condoms under his bed, and you want me to let it go." "I want you to trust me." "How can I trust you when you're clearly hiding something from me right now?" She didn't answer that. She got up from the table, and she went upstairs too. And for the first time in our marriage, I heard our bedroom door not open from me that night. I slept on the couch. I lay there in the dark, listening to the house creak around me, feeling like a stranger in it, feeling like the last honest man in a house full of people who'd closed ranks against him. And it did not occur to me, not once in the whole ugly length of that night, that I might be the one who was wrong. The next 2 weeks were the worst of my adult life, and I include in that comparison the year my first wife was dying. Emma stopped speaking to me except in the flattest, most necessary terms. Jason avoided being in the same room as me entirely, which I took as guilt, and which I now understand was closer to something between shame and restraint. The particular strain of a young man biting down on words he desperately wants to say, but can't, because saying them means breaking a promise to someone who is counting on him. Karen and I fought in whispers so the kids wouldn't hear, which is its own kind of exhausting, trying to have a screaming argument at a volume of 4. She kept telling me the same 3 things on a loop: that I needed to trust her, that I had crossed a line by going through Jason's room, and that there was an explanation, but it wasn't hers to give me. I kept telling her that a marriage doesn't work on trust me, don't ask questions, that I was her husband, and I deserved to know what was happening under my own roof. I called my sister, Denise, who has never liked Karen much, and who fanned exactly the flames you'd expect. I called an old college friend, Marcus, who told me flatly that I sounded like a man losing his mind over nothing and should apologize before I lost his family for real, which made me so angry I didn't speak to him for a week. Word got around the extended family the way it always does. Karen's sister called me to say I owed her nephew an apology. My mother called to ask what on earth was going on in my house. And by the second week, I genuinely did not know who in my life was still speaking to whom. I moved into the guest room. Emma started eating dinner in her room. The house that had 18 months earlier felt like the beginning of something whole again. Felt instead like four strangers taking turns in the kitchen so they wouldn't have to look at each other. The thing that finally broke it open happened on a Thursday night in the middle of November, almost exactly a month after that dinner. I was awake. I hadn't slept well in weeks by that point, and it was just past 1 a.m. when I heard a sound from outside, gravel crunching under tires too fast for our quiet street, and then a car door, and then, a few seconds later, pounding on our front door hard enough to rattle the frame. I came downstairs in my sweatpants, my heart already going. And through the little window beside the door, I saw a man I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, red-faced, swaying slightly like he'd had a few drinks, shouting a name I also didn't recognize. "Sophie! I know she's in there! Sophie, get out here right now!" I opened the door on the chain, which, in hindsight, was probably the only reason the next several minutes didn't go somewhere much worse. "Can I help you?" I said, and the man's eyes were wild in a way that scared me more than his volume did. "My daughter," he said. "Sophie Bennett. She's in this house. Somebody in this house has been hiding her from me for a month, and I want her out here now." I had never heard the name Sophie Bennett in my life. I told him so. He didn't believe me, and honestly at that point, given the month I'd just had, I wasn't entirely sure I believed myself either. And then, from the top of the stairs behind me, I heard Jason's voice, sharper and more frightened than I had ever heard it. "Dad! David! Don't let him in! Please! Call the police! Don't let him in!" I turned around, and there at the top of the stairs was Jason, and beside him, half hidden behind his shoulder, was a girl I had genuinely never seen before in my life. Younger than Emma, maybe 20, thin in a way that looked less like a body type and more like a recent history, with a fading bruise along her jaw that, even from the bottom of the stairs I could see had been there a while, yellowing at the edges. She was gripping the back of Jason's shirt with both hands, and she was shaking. That was the moment I understood. Not the whole story, not yet, but the shape of it. That I had gotten everything catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. I closed the door on the chain, told the man through the gap that I was calling the police right now if he didn't leave, and he shouted a few more things about how it was a family matter and none of my business. And I told him I didn't care whose father he was, that shouting at a house at 1 a.m. and trying to break down a door was a police matter whether he liked it or not. I had my phone out and dialing before I even finished the sentence, and something in my voice must have convinced him I meant it, because by the time the dispatcher picked up, I heard his car door slam again and gravel spray as he peeled off down the street. I hung up after giving the dispatcher our address and telling them the situation had resolved itself for the moment, but that we might need a welfare check on a possible domestic situation. Then I turned around and looked up the stairs at my stepson, my daughter, who had come out of her room at the noise and was standing frozen in her doorway. My wife, who was coming down the hall pulling a robe around herself, and a shaking, terrified girl I had never met. "Somebody," I said, "needs to explain to me what is happening in my house, Right now. All of it.
It took almost 2 hours, sitting in the living room with tea nobody drank, and the porch light on in case the man came back, for the whole thing to come out. And I am going to lay it out here the way I eventually understood it, because I think I owe it to Jason and to Emma to tell it properly, in a way I did not have the grace to hear it the first time.
Sophie was a classmate of Jason's from the business program at the community college. They'd started dating quietly about 4 months earlier. Quietly because Sophie's home life was, in her words, not something you bring up on a first date. Her father had a temper that got worse with drinking, and it had gotten worse still after her mother left 2 years before. Sophie had been sleeping some nights at friends' apartments, some nights in her car, for months before she ever told Jason the truth of it, because she said she was ashamed, because she kept thinking she could manage it, the way people in those situations often do, until they can't anymore. The night it finally broke, about 5 weeks before the night the man showed up at our door. Her father had come home drunk and thrown a lamp that caught her across the jaw. The bruise I'd seen at the top of the stairs, and she had called Jason from a gas station 2 miles from her house at 11 at night because she genuinely did not know who else to call. Jason picked her up. He didn't tell his mother, not because he was hiding something shameful, but because Sophie had begged him not to tell anyone, terrified that any official involvement would mean her father finding out where she was, or worse, some system swallowing her up in exactly the way she'd spent months trying to avoid. He let her sleep in his room that night on the extra mattress he kept for when his cousins visited, tucked into the closet space during the day so it wouldn't be seen. And it was supposed to be 1 night. Then it was 3. Then it became a pattern neither of them had really planned for, a girl with nowhere safe to go, and a boy who couldn't bring himself to send her back. The condoms weren't a mystery once Sophie, mortified, explained them herself, her voice shaking, refusing to look at me directly. She and Jason had, in fact, been intimate a handful of times before everything with her father escalated, back when they were just a normal couple with a normal amount of privacy problems. And she'd bought them herself and left them in his room weeks before any of the rest of this started. It had nothing to do, at any point, with Emma. It had never had anything to do with Emma. Which brought us to Emma, and the part of the story that made me feel the smallest. My daughter had been having panic attacks since her mother died. Full body, can't breathe, convinced she's dying panic attacks. Most often in the deep quiet of the middle of the night when the house was still and there was nothing to distract her from the thoughts that came for her the second she closed her eyes. She hadn't told me. She told me later, in the weeks after that night, sitting on the edge of my bed with her knees pulled up to her chest, that she hadn't told me because I was already so wrecked by Rachel's death that she didn't think I had room to carry hers too. That she'd made herself small and quiet and fine for my sake for 2 years because somebody in the house had needed to hold it together, and it clearly wasn't going to be me. Jason had found out by accident, the same way I eventually found out the rest of it. He'd heard her through the wall one night, in the first month they lived under the same roof. A sound of someone gasping for air that scared him enough to knock on her door and check. She'd been curled on her bathroom floor, hyperventilating, certain she was having a heart attack, the way her mother's decline had made her certain, at 19, that any strange feeling in her body was the beginning of the end. He hadn't left. He'd sat with her on the tile floor and talked her through a breathing exercise his father, who died of a heart attack himself, sudden, no warning, when Jason was 16, had once taught him for his own anxiety in the aftermath. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. He'd stayed until her breathing evened out and her hands stopped shaking, and then he'd walked her back to her room, and neither of them had mentioned it to anyone the next day. Happened again a few nights later. And then it became, without either of them ever deciding it out loud, a routine. Emma would feel one coming on, or wake already in the grip of one, and she'd go to the one person in the house who'd proven he knew how to talk her down without making it a whole event, without waking the household, without turning her into something fragile that needed to be managed. She went to his room instead of the other way around, because his room was farther from ours, because the walls muffled things better on that end of the hall, because at 17, 19, you would rather nearly die quietly than let your grieving father watch you fall apart one more time. The sound I'd heard that Tuesday night through the plaster, the rising moan, cut short, the hushed voices, the catch of breath, had been exactly what it sounded like on its face, and nothing at all like what I'd assumed. My daughter, mid-panic attack, trying to smother her own crying so the house wouldn't hear, and Jason's low, steady voice walking her through the count, and the gasp of someone finally getting air back into her lungs. The showers at 12:30 were her cooling down afterward, her body still running hot with adrenaline, unable to sleep until she'd washed the panic off her, like it was something physical. The journal entry I'd read, "He's the only one who gets it. I need him more than I've ever needed anyone. It's our secret," had never once been about romance. It had been about a girl who'd found in her stepbrother, of all people, the one person in her collapsing world who didn't flinch when she fell apart, who never once told her she was too much, who kept a secret she'd begged him to keep because she was ashamed of needing it kept. I sat in my living room at 3 a.m. and understood that I had spent a month building a case against two people whose actual crime, between them, was protecting each other. Jason protecting a frightened, homeless girlfriend from a violent father and a system he wasn't sure would help her, and Emma protecting her own grief from a father she decided, correctly or not, couldn't bear one more piece of bad news. I want to tell you the rest of that night went smoothly, that I apologized beautifully and everyone forgave me on the spot and we all hugged it out over cold tea. But that's not how any of this works, and I'd be lying to you, the way I'd been lying to myself for a month if I told it that way. What actually happened is that I sat there for a long time saying nothing at all, because I genuinely did not trust myself to open my mouth without either crying or saying something that made it worse. Karen watched me from across the room with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not quite triumphant, not quite forgiving, something more tired than either. "I knew about Sophie," she said finally, quietly. "Jason told me 3 weeks ago, after he saw how bad things had gotten with you and Emma, because he couldn't stand watching you tear the family apart over the wrong thing and not say something was going on, even if he couldn't say what. I promised him I wouldn't tell you unless it became necessary. That's the thing I couldn't explain. That's the both I meant that night at dinner. I couldn't tell you what was really happening, and I couldn't tell you Emma's part either because that wasn't mine to give away." "You could have told me you at least knew something," I said, "instead of just telling me to trust you blind." "I did tell you that," she said. "You didn't want to hear trust without proof. You wanted a confession that matched the story you'd already written." She wasn't wrong, and I have had a long time since that night to sit with how not wrong she was. I called the police non-emergency line the next morning, once everyone had finally, exhaustedly, gone to bed, and asked what our options were for a young adult in Sophie's situation. She was 20, technically an adult, which meant no one could simply return her anywhere. But it also meant the systems built for minors in danger didn't automatically apply to her either. Karen, it turned out, had already quietly looked into exactly this weeks earlier, which was another piece of the puzzle I hadn't known. A domestic violence advocacy organization 2 towns over that helped young adults get emergency housing and eventually
a restraining order. We drove Sophie there ourselves 2 days later. Her father was arrested about 6 weeks after that on an unrelated assault charge involving a different family member entirely, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he was, and how much worse it could have gotten for Sophie if we hadn't intervened when we did.
Emma and I did not fix things in one conversation either. It took weeks, some of it in a family therapist's office that Karen insisted on, most of it in small moments, her leaving her door open again at night, me learning, slowly and clumsily, how to sit with her during a bad night, instead of trying to solve it, or worse, trying to hide from how bad it actually was. I learned the breathing count Jason had taught her. I learned to just be a body in the room instead of a father demanding to fix things. I'm not going to pretend I became instantly good at this. I'm still not entirely good at it. But I am better than I was. And Emma, slowly, started leaving her door unlocked to me the way she'd never stopped leaving it unlocked to Jason. Jason and I had the hardest conversation of all, weeks later. Both of us sitting on the back porch steps because neither of us wanted to look the other one in the eye while we said it. I told him I was sorry, that I'd looked at a young man who had done nothing but show up for 2 frightened people in his life and decided he was a predator because it was easier than asking a question. He told me, and I've thought about this 100 times since, that the worst part hadn't been the accusation itself. It had been how fast I'd believed it. I get why it looked bad, he said. I get the condoms, I get the sneaking around, I get all of it if I'm being honest with you. But you didn't ask me a single question before you decided who I was. You just decided. I didn't have a good answer for that. I still don't. Not one that makes it okay. All I could tell him was that I'd carry that for a long time, and that I intended to be a different kind of father and stepfather going forward. One who asks before he accuses, who remembers that the story that fits the evidence fastest is not always the true one. Sophie still comes around sometimes, over a year later now. She's got her own apartment 2 towns over, a part-time job, a restraining order that's held so far, and a standing invitation to Sunday dinner that she takes us up on more often than not. Jason and Emma are closer now than any 2 step-siblings I've ever heard of, in the plain, unglamorous way of 2 people who went through something together and came out the other side still choosing each other. Emma still has bad nights sometimes. They're farther apart now than they used to be, and when they come, more often than not, it's me sitting on the bathroom floor with her these days, counting to 4. Think about that dinner table a lot. The version of me who set his fork down and decided, before either of them said a word, that he already knew the truth. I think about how certain I was. I think about how the sound through the wall, the box under the bed, the whispered conversations, all of it lined up so perfectly into a story I could believe, and how none of it was true, and how close I came to blowing my family apart over a story I'd written myself out of fear and grief and 3 weeks of bad sleep. If you'd asked me, that Tuesday night at the bottom of the stairs, what I thought I was about to uncover, I would have told you I already knew. I was wrong about almost everything that mattered. And I think about how many of us, in how many houses, are sitting up right now certain of something we haven't actually asked a single honest question about. And I wonder how many of those stories would fall apart the same way mine did if we ever worked up the nerve to just ask.